Alrighty, so we are live. Hello everyone, I'm Jamie Dokovna with Becker and Polyakov, and I am here with Dr. Shanequa Fleming, who's amazing, and this is our second webinar, which I adore speaking with her because she's so wonderful. She is the CEO and founder of Culture Accelerators, excuse me. Her website is We Accelerate the Culture. She's phenomenal. She works with organizations and executives to reimagine, repurpose, reorganize, to help elevate an organization. She forecasts trends and really helps from the inside out. And so she's here to talk with me and everyone again today about what's going on in COVID-19 and really everything else. So welcome, Shanequa. Good to have you.
Thank you. Good to be back. Good to be back. It's always great talking with you. You talked about me being wonderful. I think you recognize it because you spot it when you've got it. So.
Oh, amen. Exactly. So, one of the things I thought about before we started today, and I wanted to kind of pick up where we left off. And one of the things that we had talked about was, are we reopening too soon? And Americans, over half of them said, yes, we're opening too soon. And so now we're well into 90 days, 3 months of, what we're dealing with COVID-19 and what we as employees and as employers are dealing with. And a lot's changed, a lot's still the same. And, who knows, do you think we open too soon now that we're one more month in and we're now seeing in a lot of places, not everywhere, but a lot of places, an increase?
Well, that question is complex, right? Did we open too soon? So it really is a question that, quite frankly, I can't say yes or no to. But what I can tell you is that if we have found ourselves in a situation where we have, quote unquote, reopened and we have not listened to or considered the perspectives of everyone that is impacted by that decision to return to the office or, return to business as much as possible as usual, then I think the answer lies there. And so that's an individual inventory, if you will, and it really can only be honestly answered with integrity if we've really considered the impact that it has on everyone as it relates to that shift.
Yeah, no, and I've been reading some other surveys because I find it very intriguing what people are thinking as, businesses continue to reopen, continue to operate. And it's interesting to see how employees feel about coming back to work and are employers doing enough to make sure that they are safe. And interesting because one of the things I hadn't thought about really wasn't so much the concern of what the employers are doing, which we can talk about, but with respect to the employees, but what they're doing with respect to the customers that their employees have to interface with. And so while on the one hand, they may feel that their employers are doing a lot of really great things or doing things to protect them and make them feel comfortable and valued. But in the same time, what are they doing to protect them from the customer who may not realize that they are not making the employees feel comfortable when they walk into a particular business?
Right. It's interesting you bring that up because that's the thought that I had right after I answered the question. So if we are practicing and engaging in behaviors that do not demonstrate, again, like we talked about last time, that we're taking the necessary precautions that we can take, then I think we're creating distress for people that is unnecessary. And in that, and we're also creating greater health risk because we understand that this is something that is not quite understood in terms of how quickly it's being spread and how specifically it's being spread. We know some things, but there's still a lot of unknowns. And we also know that there's no vaccine that has been introduced to kind of mitigate the spreading of this virus. And so, yes, I agree with you. We've got to think about all of those things. And then there are just so many other things that we're seeing, right? And the signals that are telling us that there are things that we should be paying attention to. And so when we see organizations not pay attention to that, you really do create a culture that is very difficult for people to embrace.
No, absolutely. Because I mean, listen, people have to work. We don't know if the government subsidies are going to be extended. And if they are extended, are they going to be extended to the same extent that they were in the past? Are we going to see or continue to see the $600 supplement when you are on unemployment, or is that going away? And right now we don't know that. And so for a lot of people, the prospect of going back to work, if they may have otherwise been unemployed and now need to go back and integrate into the workforce, what are they going to be feeling when they go back into the workforce, knowing that they may have to engage with the public, and is their employer doing enough?
Right. And, we would be remiss if we didn't talk about the fact that that's also being compounded by what's happening in the world as it relates to race and race relations and racism. And so not only is there a lot of tension and angst about something that we've never seen before as it relates to a pandemic, but we're also experiencing an eruption, if you will, of consciousness, and an eruption of just people understanding that things are not equitable in many ways. And so we talked a little bit about that last time, Jamie, as it relates to COVID-19 and the disparities that we see as it relates to healthcare and responsiveness for communities that are predominantly populated by minorities. But now we've actually added some layers to that. So we're in a really interesting space right now.
No, absolutely. And I think that it's something that a lot of businesses are thinking about. And we've certainly seen a lot of messages because people feel compelled that they need to talk about what's going on in the world, because like you're right, COVID-19 is still a discussion that we continue to have because we still continue to be affected by it. But now we're also having this conversation about race, about equity in the workplace, about how COVID-19, for example, is disproportionately affecting minorities. And so how, when you have minorities that are in, a large percentage of them are in these essential jobs, and knowing that it's impacting them disproportionately, what can we do? And I think it's important that we're having this conversation, because the conversation is only one piece of that puzzle, right? It has to be a little bit more, because obviously from my perspective, there's a legal aspect to it. And, as long as I've been practicing law, which feels like a really long time at this point, but as long as I've been practicing law, it's been illegal to make decisions in the workplace that are race-based. And so we've always known that as the backdrop, doing what I do. But in the same vein, there obviously hasn't been a lot of these conversations because it continues to happen. And so it's one thing to talk about it, but I also think it's another thing to demonstrate action. It can't just be the message that you put out. It also has to be action that's coming from within. And what can we do as an organization, and what can we do as employees to really create what we want to see?
Right, absolutely. And I think, as you bring that up, there's a really critical piece that as leaders we have to do, and that's listen. So, we're not going to know everything, and there's always a lot to learn, but it all really begins with listening. And in listening, you really can hear perspectives that you may not have otherwise have heard. And as a foresight practitioner and someone that really looks at organizations and help them kind of, reimagine and what the future looks like for them, I say to people that if I'm not in your thoughts, and if I'm not in, and this can go for COVID, this can go for anything really, when we talk about racism, if I'm not in your thoughts, then I'm not going to be in your future, because you're not considering what it would look like, how it would impact me, what would be the ramifications if, my needs or my the things that I need to sustain are even in question for you, or even a thought for you, then you can't plan for that. And so we've seen this, right? We've seen this, and this is a history that our country has. And so I think right now, it's nothing new that's happening. And to your point, it takes time. But the question is, does it really take time, or does it really take us being truthful? And I think it's a little bit of both. The time has come for us to be truthful, and for us to really look at what's happening and how these things have a ripple effect, because these are all, microcosms of a macrocosm. And so we look at disparity from COVID-19. We look at, inequity as it relates to how organizations might be structured, whether it's intentional or not. And they all create a really, really interesting place from not only a legal perspective, but from an organizational culture perspective. And so the reality of it is if we don't address these things, we're going to continue to see all kinds of things ripple out of this.
No, and I think that what's interesting, and to your point about this, perspective of timing and, how long it sort of has taken us to get there. I think what's interesting because, in my mind, I think about the parallel of how we have dealt with COVID-19, because we've had to propel change and difference and reaction in a much faster way than we've ever had before. I mean, we've had years, of dealing with, other types of diseases or viruses, et cetera, and we have vaccines, and COVID-19 comes out last year and we don't have a vaccine. We don't know how to deal with it. And we're, 6 months, 7 months in, and we are dealing with it. I mean, there are companies that, are trying to create a vaccine, that have created a vaccine, that are testing a vaccine. And so you're seeing this, warp speed trajectory that we haven't seen before. And it's interesting to your point, why can't we do that with other things? Why does it have to take so long? Or, why are we looking back sometimes with a reflection, wow, it's been, 6 years or 10 years since we've had this last conversation, but yet it remains the same. So why aren't we seeing, a difference when it comes to other things that we're now saying, are equally important to us? It's important to us. And you see that with businesses that are putting out that message, but like I said, it's not just enough to put out that message. You have to also have the actions to back it up, because otherwise we're going to continue on the carousel and not really get off and make any sort of progress.
Right. So we become responsive, or we really see change when a couple things happen, when things are either impacting us in a way where it's telling us and it's giving us a good cue or a good clue that our systems are outdated, or our systems are being compromised in a way that really threatens viability. And so you could look at that in any context, whether it be the virus that we're talking about, whether it be racism. So we know that this system is outdated. We know that it was never really designed to work for people of color, Black people in particular. And so, but we've come to a point where now it is threatening the viability of our country in a way that we can no longer ignore. And so the same is true for the virus. This virus is threatening life and it's taking lives. And if we don't have a response to this and we continue to react to this, then we're going to find ourselves in a place of, status quo, or in a place of we're really going to be stressed and taxed on so many different levels. And so I think as we, as leaders and as organizations and as, businesses and companies and as communities, we've really got to remove the knee-jerk reaction and start to think about what is it that we really want to create moving forward, whether it be safety in our workplace, or whether it be a different future altogether as it relates to how we move forward. And so in both of those instances, that question has to be answered, and it has to go beyond, the safety protocols, those basic safety protocols, and it has to really stretch into us having a mindset and a focus point of, what are those things that do not serve us, and what are those things that will not serve us.
Well, and I think that's interesting because, in a lot of, I think a lot of things that we think about from our own perspective. And one of the things about COVID-19, for example, it doesn't discriminate. Yes, it disproportionately affects minorities, but everyone can get it. I mean, we as humans, we know we are not, immune to it. Maybe some people have more of immunity than others. And we're seeing, some people that are asymptomatic and, learning how to deal with that, but it really is everybody's problem. And, you compare compare that with something like racism, and, you know, it's not just, you know, a Black problem. I mean, it really is a human problem, and you have to look at them both with the same lens, if you will, to figure out how you're really going to adjust to it, because it affects everyone, and how are we going to move forward in a way that looks the way we think it should look, as opposed to the way that it's looking right now.
Right. That's really good. I know we had a lot of questions this time.
Yeah, no, we definitely did. And so, you know, I'm going to take it back and talk about some of the, you know, COVID-19 issues, because one of the things that, you know, I'm seeing, at least, you know, people are still really curious about the safety aspect of COVID-19 and making sure that they're doing what is right within their organization. And, you know, we got a question from Jacqueline, and Jacqueline asked, you know, how do I, you know, require people in common spaces to wear masks? And Jacqueline, I'm sure if you've seen the news, there are a lot of places, states, counties, cities, et cetera, that are now requiring and putting in mandates that they're requiring businesses to require the patrons that are coming into these businesses to wear masks, and, you know, to protect the herd, the greater good. And so, you know, from my perspective, I think as a business, I mean, listen, you got to comply with the law. I mean, and I think that's, you know, always going to be a truism. And so if people come into the common space and they're not practicing social distancing, or they are not wearing a mask, I think you as a business owner have a right to remind them, one, to social distance, and two, to ask them to put on a mask. And I would even go one step further, that I think that it's important that, you know, you do it also for the benefit and at least the comfort of employees, knowing that they have to come in and show up to work. What are you doing to protect them when they see, for example, someone come up, you know, if they're in, you know, a store, you know, and you come up to the cash register, and the person that you're checking out, even though you have a plexiglass, you have a mask on and they don't. So, you know, maybe a lot of these businesses want to think about making sure that they have these extra masks that they can then provide to people, you know, hey, listen, put one on. And if they don't have one, to then provide them with a mask and say, listen, you know, we are required by the county, the city, or we as an organization, we need to protect our employees.
I like that, Jamie. And I like what you said about, you know, making it, and I'm going to paraphrase what I heard, making it easier to be in relationship with you as a business, right? And so if we can, so, you know, it's not just about compliance gets us so far, but it's really about creating more collaborative relationships. And this, again, is in the context of any aspect of what we're talking about today. And so we've got to, number one, understand where people are, try to meet them there as much as we possibly can, and then create some alternative solutions that will not just allow you to be a great employer, but also allow you to be open to understanding and meeting people where they are. So you can even use that as an opportunity to help them be educated as to why this is so important. So I love that. And I think we see that in so many things. People don't know sometimes what they don't know. And sometimes the fear of what's unknown creates more of a disconnect than it does a connection. And so I think as leaders, there's always the opportunity to create teachable moments. And if we're an organization, in the processes and the frameworks and the systems that we use, there should be baked in opportunities for you to not only learn, but for you to provide teachable moments for everyone that you touch.
No, 100%. And, you know, and I think it goes a long way, because, you know, I've, you know, other than Jacqueline, I had received that question before in the past. So it is obviously something that's weighing on the minds of business owners in the past. And I can't remember his name, but, you know, he had indicated that he owns an office space, and he wanted to know, can I require people who come into the office space to wear a mask? And the answer is yes, why not? I mean, I think it's a problem if you as a business, you know, decide who you think should be wearing a mask versus who shouldn't. But if you make the policy even-handed and you apply it evenly across the board, it makes it very hard for someone to say, well, why are you singling me out? And, you know, a lot of these policies that are getting put in place, a lot of the laws that are getting put in place with respect to requiring the mask in public, I mean, they do make exceptions, because obviously we understand that there's, you know, not many absolutes in life. I mean, obviously, the old adage about what's absolute versus what's not, but, that it does have an exception. For example, if they have a person that has a medical condition and they in fact can't wear a mask, or if it's a religious accommodation that they're asking for, so they don't have to wear a mask. So you'll see a lot of people will. There may be a very small percentage of people that can't or won't because of their religious beliefs.
I think it's a classic case of, we don't lead to the exception. We have to understand what's the greater good, but we have to consider the exceptions. And so when you find yourself in a situation where people are asking for something, yet policy is, like you said, policy and laws are what they are. And I find that they are strengthened when we have practices, right? And so those consistent practices, because if there's a practice that you have and everyone is expected to adhere to those practices and demonstrate those types of behaviors, then I think the conversation changes. It becomes an issue when the practice or the policy or the law only applies to some. And again, this conversation has such a parallel in terms of what we've talked about as it relates to COVID-19, as well as racism.
No, 100%. And it may seem odd, I think, to people that you can make these parallels, but, I think that's one of the things that's so interesting when we've talked about it, is that there are lots of references that you can take from, whether, like you said, it's dealing with COVID-19 or dealing with race, or, maybe even other issues that at the end of the day, it's back to this dialogue, this conversation about making people feel safe, about creating the culture that you want, about, like what you do is, repurpose, reimagine, see the trends and take people where they, want to go, as opposed to where they are now, which may not be where they want to be.
And that's just it, because it's all about our beliefs, our values, our attitudes, and our experiences. And so when you look at those things and you really have an open mind to understand that people may have different experiences, they may have different values, they may have different beliefs about things, and you understand how that really all comes together to translate into behavior, then you can have a different dialogue. I think it's when we dismiss the fact that all of those things that really attribute to behavior or practice are things that we can't always see, that's where we start to see those points of conflict. That's where we start to see that there's more disconnect than there is connection. And that's where we start to see that there's a great divide, whether it be in the disparities we see in healthcare or any other aspect as it relates to the things that we need to be viable and we need to be well-rounded human beings.
No, and I think at the end of the day, it's like you go back and there has to be that introspection. You have to think about, the whys, why is it this way? And, if you can't go back and it doesn't make you feel comfortable when you answer the why, because we don't care or because it's not really important to us, that may not really be a good reason, and so you have to be a little bit reflective about that and say, okay, well, we're doing it this way. Maybe we need to pivot and do something else that is really better or for the greater good.
Right. All right. I'm clicking on the chat to see what other questions we have there. Do you see any there, Jamie? I don't have my glasses on today, so this is...
Uh-oh. Yeah, isn't that scary when you can't see? It's a frightening thing, I haven't... Thankfully, I had put my contacts in today, so I'm good.
Somewhat, but it's interesting.
So we did have another question from Tracy, and Tracy had asked about, how many people can you have in the office at one time? And I think that, obviously the answer is it depends on your office space, because one of the things that we know, and we go back to these, ideas, which are, the CDC and local health directives have really been telling us since the beginning, social distance. And so if you don't have the luxury of being able to require people to socially distance because the office space may be too small, well, then you have to think about that, because we don't want to put employees in a situation where they can't socially distance,
right.
And even if they have a mask on, I don't know that everyone feels comfortable with, just social distance. Or just a mask, for example, that I think a lot of people want to see both and as many safety measures put in place.
Right. So, Jamie, you talked about, and we couched this talk, when safety is not enough, right? So when you think about what else we need to be talking about right now, beyond safety, beyond the things that we've already talked about, beyond the obvious questions, or some of the things that have to deal with the protocols, when safety is not enough, where does that lead you as you think about, how we transition, how we move forward, all of those things as it relates to COVID-19, or the state of our world right now?
No, and I think that's what's, so important, because safety obviously is a very big issue, and it's really on the forefront of everyone's mind. Like I said, I mean, people want to feel safe when you go to work. No one wants to feel that they're not safe if they go to work. And, I didn't have this question specific for today, but I can tell you I have had this question come up multiple times from many different clients about employees that are afraid to come to work. And, it's interesting because in a lot of situations, it then creates a reaction from clients, where they're like, well, wait a minute, do I need to be sort of scared of my employees? Because, listen, a lot of employers are concerned about potential claims that may arise because of COVID-19, or because of how they handle COVID-19, or, talking about these different parallels with race, or because of how they deal with race and how they deal with racism, that they don't necessarily want to be in their organization, but they may find that, when they dig under the hood, so to speak, a little bit, and you look up and see what's in the car, you may see that the engine's, not running the way you need it to, because maybe, it doesn't have all the right parts that you need to be operating, at all cylinders.
That's a really good point, because you brought up something. You talked about fear, and I think, when fear is present, it's an underlying issue, because fear will, suck the air out of a conversation before it even happens. Fear will stop us from taking the actions that we know we need to take, or it will cause us to take actions that we know might be inherently not the right ones to get us where we want to go. And so I think, one of the things that, as I reflect on that question myself, I think where we've really got to focus is opening up dialogue, and to really understand what people's experiences are. And so, because if we can understand what an experience is, then we can identify where the gaps might be in terms of what they're actually experiencing and what we intend for them to experience. And so, to your point, if we are not doing that, then we have a lot of missed opportunity. And if we are doing that and we find that, okay, this is really how we feel about it, and we're not willing to move on that, then that's a whole different conversation. And, you get what you get, and you don't get upset, because you can't want things to be, that sounds like a preschool line, right? But it's true. You can't want it to be, you can't want, for example, you cannot want the effectiveness and the efficiency of your employees, but you don't want to grant them safety. You cannot want the advantages of innovation and creativity, but you don't want to have a conversation about diversity and inclusion. You just can't do that. It's not possible. It's not realistic. And in fact, what happens is you have a watered down version at best, and then you breed a whole environment of inauthenticity, and people aren't going to trust you, whether it be your customers, whether it be your employees, whether it be your partners, whether it be the community. And so it starts to create a very different conversation for you, not only as a leader, as an organization, but in your marketplace. And so I think this conversation is not one that is a nice to have, it's a must have, because and let's just talk, bottom line, right? Let's talk about that for a moment. Regardless of where you are on any of these issues, if you are in business, no one went in business simply because they just wanted to have their name on a logo or something. You went in business to make money. And so, no, you're not doing these things just because you can make money. But what you've got to understand, if nothing else gets your attention, this is not going to allow you to be viable and to even be present in the marketplace if people don't trust that you're going to be a good steward steward or be a good fiduciary of the things that you're supposed to do as it relates to, your brand promise and all of these other things, or even your employee promise. So this is a conversation we've got to have. And the leaders that are not having this conversation, you're behind the eight ball, because I'm telling you, I'm talking to many leaders and many different organizations, and they are prepared and leading the charge on this. And so leaders that aren't doing this, you're going to find yourself in a space where it's going to be extremely difficult to navigate because you've elected to stick your head in the sand, whether it be COVID-19, whether it be inequality and inequities as it relates to race and other minority groups. We have got to have the conversation, and we've got to move to action.
No, I think it's really important. To your point, you really have to have this notion of being proactive as opposed to being reactive, because when you're reactive, you may not make the same decisions when you can think about it a little bit more and decide what you're going to do. And, nobody likes feeling like they're behind the eight ball, and it's all those sayings, hindsight is 2020. I mean, and sometimes you may not make the right decisions, at least not initially and off the bat, but that's okay. I mean, I think that sometimes people do make decisions because they're afraid, that they're not going to say the right thing, or they're afraid they're not going to do the right thing, or they're afraid, what may happen if they do certain things. But, I think at the end of the day, it's okay to say, you know what, this wasn't a good thing to do, or, we've tried it this way and we've seen that it really hasn't worked for us. And I think that's okay. And I think a lot of people will accept that if you own it and, try again.
Right. And so here's the thing, where we're talking about a lot of things that really, they sound great in conversation and theory. So someone might be watching this and they may be asking, so what do we do about it? Like, what are the actions we can take? What are the steps we can take? And I will tell you, one of the things that my firm and I do with our clients is you first have to have a conversation, and you've got to talk to people. So it all begins with, number one, have a conversation. Right? Be very clear, even going into that conversation, what are you expecting to get out of that conversation? What's your end goal? Like, what are your goals? Where would you like to be? And based on that, you have a conversation to understand, where are people in the experience that you're trying to provide for them? And once you know where they are in that experience, then you can start to take the necessary steps to close those gaps that you talked about earlier, Jamie. And so I think the first thing is to open up the dialogue, and then to be committed to action, some type of action, and then to set a course for how you're going to actually achieve that action. And one of the other things I'd recommend is identify some partners on the journey, right? Because there are people that are doing some of these things, and they're further ahead, and maybe there's some people that aren't quite as far as you are. So share and share with others that you can help bring forward, and also pull from others that can help pull you forward. But it has to be a collaborative effort in all of this, whether it be how you're returning to work. There are tons of resources that, we've shared, and I know Becker has shared, as it relates to how to transition back into an environment where people are safe, and people are not just safe, but productive and effective, and hitting some really amazing milestones and continue to do the things that your organization needs. But on the other hand, there are also things that you can do in terms of reaching out to us and finding out how we can help you. How can we help you discover those things that you need? Because this is uncharted waters, as we talked about before, and there really are a lot of resources, but those resources will mean nothing if we don't, number one, make some type of commitment to action and moving forward.
No, absolutely. I mean, and it's, I think we'd be remiss not to talk about, how do you actually do that? I mean, and, I think that there are a lot of companies out there that run surveys, where you can ask your employees, how do you feel about the steps we're taking to make sure that you're safe? And then, by the way, I think it's okay to ask them too, what else, if anything, do you want to see? And it can be a survey. It can also be, I know I have some clients that have, what we call like generically like task force, or people that are assigned groups of dealing with particular, singular issues, so they can really focus on it and then have conversations with people about, what they're thinking, so they know from an organization. So we make sure that we don't have these disconnects in terms of, this is what we think our customers think, versus when you ask them, you may find out that your customers think something very different than you think they think. And same thing with employees. You may think that your employees think that you're doing everything and they feel safe, and it's because you're requiring people to wear masks or social distance, etc. But if you ask them, they may tell you something very different. And then I think in some of those instances, you may not want to hear it, but it's kind of necessary that you do.
Right. Right. I like that. So we ask, that's one thing that you can do. And another thing that Jamie and I have talked a lot about is invite people in on the action, right? And I'm couching it a little differently today, but invite them in on the action, because most often the people that are making the decisions are furthest removed from the process that they're making the decision about. And so the closer you get to your point of impact, the more effective your strategies, the more effective your approach, the more effective your communication, the more effective you fill in the blank is going to be. And so the further away you are from that, the bigger the opportunity for a missed opportunity, the bigger the opportunity for you to miss something, or for there to be a missed opportunity even. So I think inviting people in on the action allows us to really accelerate the curve of those things that we want to change, right?
No, absolutely. And, once you even, I should say, after you get there and you've had these conversations, what is it that you do? And I think, then it's the action part of it. And I think that we all have some obligation to make sure that there's actions behind those, discussions, or that are propelled from those discussions. Because, for example, we have a question from Michelle, and Michelle had asked, how far can I take things, in terms of enforcing what the CDC says, for example, and I think you have to take it as far as you need to take it. And, the CDC has a list of guidelines, and, listen, we're all very familiar in the workspace what guidelines are. I mean, we have them. They start with employee handbooks. It's a guideline, it's not a contract. It's not a law. It's not a mandate. It's a guideline, what you should be doing. I mean, I think in some instances you can do lots of things, and in other instances you may be a little hindered. And so you have to think about it from a business perspective. There's lots of suggestions in here. There's lots of guidelines about how you need to operate, but you also have to figure out from an organizational perspective, how can you then utilize it to make it work for you and to make it work for your business.
I love Michelle's question, because what it makes me think about is, as an organization, as a company, you've got to determine what is your unique positioning on any of this, right? Do you want to be a leader in this, right? Because if you want to be a leader, those actions look very different. But if you want to be someone that's going to help stabilize the things that are working well, then that's a very different position also. So you've got to determine, first of all, how do you want to show up in all of this? Because that's going to determine your path for action, if you will. So if you're asking a question of how far can you go, the question is, how far do you want to go? And all of the answers are right answers, because each of those answers will lead you down the right path, right? So if you're, Albert Einstein has this quote, and it talks about, if you're expecting a fish to climb a tree, then that fish is always going to look like they're incapable, right? Because that's not what the quote says, but I'm paraphrasing, because you're asking a fish to do something that it is not genetically or otherwise designed to do. And so if you're asking yourself to take on a level of problem solving and solution finding that's beyond what that you naturally gravitate to, then it's going to be a lot more challenging for you. Now, am I saying that you don't need to take courageous action and push the envelope? Absolutely not. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, you've got to figure out what your point of readiness is, and then push the envelope from there. So what looks right for Jamie may not look right for Shanequa, and that's okay. But what is not okay is for us to do nothing, and for us not to be clear and communicative about where we are and where we're stretching to go.
No, absolutely. And I think, it's, again, you see all these common things. It's that introspection. It's the figuring out, who you are. I mean, and sometimes you may have limitations, and it's okay that you can't do everything, because nobody expects everyone to do everything all the time and be everything to everybody else. I mean, you can't. I mean, we have certain limitations. And I think if you accept that, that's okay. But you also have to decide, are these limitations something that I'm just creating out of fear, or is this, a limitation that really is real? Because, for example, physically, I only have, a small space, so I don't really have the luxury of social distancing. And it's not because you don't want to, it's because you can't. So I think in those situations, while you may not be able to follow, for example, all of the guidelines, you may have to, follow a few of them. Like, for example, have rotating work shifts, have people, and one of the questions that we got was from an employee, which is great, because listen, we're really talking about both sides. And I think it's important to talk about both sides. Susan had a question, how can I convince my boss to let me work from home? And, I think it's just a discussion that you have. I think sometimes working remotely is a really viable way of getting work done. And at the end of the day, businesses are looking at how they operate and whether or not people remain productive while they work remotely. Because at the end of the day, you're right. I mean, businesses are in business to make money, and unless they're, a nonprofit, and even then they still, have to generate some kind of income to continue to operate. And at the end of the day, I mean, those are the types of things that employers are looking at. And for example, in a really well-developed remote work policy, and by the way, funny enough, there are lots of employers out there that have been doing this, since technology has enabled them to do it. And they, really develop it in a way that it's like, let's see if this works for me. And if you are the kind of employee that can work remotely, and we are the kind of company that can allow you, or the position is one that allows you to work remotely, then we're going to go ahead and we're going to try it. I had a client just yesterday that I was talking to about employees that wanted to continue working remotely, even though they were back and open for business. And the concern that they had, and rightfully so, was that when a lot of these employees who are good employees and they don't really have any issue with the work product, but when they were home or working remotely from wherever, but not in the office, these people were working at, 70%. And so a lot of these businesses, because of the challenges with COVID-19, from their perspective, it's, I can't allow you to operate at 70%. I need you at a minimum at 100%, understanding, that there are lots of challenges with working from home. And, I even had another client a few days ago that said to me, it's not just good enough anymore for my employees to give me 100%. I'm really looking for 125%. And, I don't really think that's necessarily unfair. It's a fear that, listen, if I don't require as much of you that I'm willing to give you in return, I don't know if I'm going to be in business next year. So I need you to be really, all hands on deck. It can't just be, well, I want to, plug in when it's convenient for me. I need to be plugged in all the time.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because I hear it, and this is why I love our conversation. I hear a totally different perspective. I hear a business or an organization that really needs to reimagine how they do their work, because requiring someone to give 125%, first of all, there's an issue in there that I'd love to talk to that person. And number two, if you were only getting 70% before, then that is not a location issue. That's a performance management issue, and that's a leadership issue. So that's a whole nother conversation. And so I think a lot of times the leader has to understand, and the leader being the leader of the organization or the leader of the team or the leader of the unit or whatever, has to understand that what they're expecting, you've really got to help create the roadmap to get there. And the same is true if we take it back to your first comment today, Jamie, when you talked about, the question you had about, how do stores really ask things of customers so that employees can be safe. So I think therein lies the opportunity to be clear about expectations and to be clear about agreements that you have, whether it be working agreements, customer agreements, service agreements, you name it. And I think you know, an agreement and a contract is one of the most powerful documents. And, you know, I'm talking to a lawyer, so I don't have to convince you of that.
Right.
It's one of the
No.
most powerful things that we can have because it clearly outlines what's expected of you and what's expected of me. It also outlines what will happen for me to put you in the best situation to do your job and for me to be in the best situation to do my job. And I think that conversation, again, if we really just stripped everything away from what we're talking about today, and we really talk about how agreements are determined and how we actually move forward in any relationship whenever there is an imbalance or an inequity or a misunderstanding or there's an expectation that has not been agreed upon, then we find ourselves in these conversations about disparity, about inequity, about, you know, not seeing it from another perspective or not wanting to see it from another perspective because somewhere along the lines we've not been clear.
Yeah, no, and I think to your point, I mean, it's really well taken, and that's what I was talking about, you know, with employers that have really well developed policies. And, you know, fortunately for them, they had it prior to COVID-19, you know, prior to being forced to, you know, really pivot and figure out what works. And, you know, I love this idea of, you know, really communicating what your expectations are, because a lot of problems do arise because there is a lack of communication in terms of what is expected. And if you aren't clear in what you want and what you expect, then how do you expect in return people to live up to those expectations if they don't even know what they are?
Right. So Jamie, we got a question, and I'm gonna throw this one to you because I think you'll have fun with this one. What if an employee is not performing? So basically what they want to know, what if an employee is not performing and needs to be let go, but the employer is waiting for a PPP loan forgiveness? Does that disqualify the employer for the loan forgiveness? That is a very interesting question, but I'm sure it's one that many people have.
Yeah, no, it is. It's a really important question. I mean, one of the things that we are seeing with the PPP loan forgiveness aspect and just with PPP in general is that we've seen a little bit of a relaxing of what the restrictions are. Not to say that there aren't restrictions on that loan, because there certainly are, but you're seeing a little bit of relaxing because the reality is the reason why it was given is because the government wants to see employers continue to employ people, and they want to see businesses continue to operate, not because they want to give people money and they don't want you to be in business next year, right? I mean, there is an expectation that you will be, so they're relaxing some of the standards. But, you know, I think I don't necessarily know that I would even tie it to the PPP because, you know, obviously, I mean, from my perspective, you know, when you have an employee that is not performing or not meeting your expectations, you need to communicate that to them. And I can't tell you how many times in, you know, almost 20 years of practice that I've heard, you know, people tell me about bad employees. And, you know, I'm always dumbfounded when they give me this laundry list of reasons why this person should no longer be with them. And, you know, when I ask the question, sort of turn it around, I'm like, why is the person still there? And, you know, it's sort of like, well, I knew you were going to ask me that. Well, of course I'm going to ask you that because you just given me a laundry list of reasons of why this person is not a good fit for you. And they're still there, you know, and the excuses that you're giving to me, I don't really think are good from an organizational perspective because they're really just excuses, you know, oh, it's hard to find people, you know, good help is hard to find. Well, really, good help is that hard to find? I mean, there are a lot of people out there in this world that can do the job that you need them to do, and maybe this isn't a good fit for them. And who wants a person coming to work who doesn't want to be there, right?
Right, and maybe your process of how you are sourcing for talent needs work, right? So something you just said is so I'm chuckling because if someone is not doing a great job and they're not meeting expectations, it didn't just start in March.
Right.
And so it kind of goes back to those expectations. I, from an HR perspective, would say that I believe it's out of integrity to make a decision like that simply because you don't want to lose the funding, because those are two different things. And I get it. I get that there are, you know, a lot of stipulations around how the loan is forgiven or what have you. But it says if these things apply, the loan is forgiven. So in that particular case, it doesn't sound like it applies. So it sounds like that forgiveness piece doesn't, if you have to deal with an issue in your business, that means that you're electing not to do good business simply because your personal benefits could outweigh what you really need to do. And so that's a red flag for me, because you cannot put your personal interests above the interest of doing what's right for the organization. That's when we run into issues. And I'm sure that there's more to that story. So that's not a statement of judgment. That's a statement of there's a lot going on there. And that's just a signal that some other things are unraveling to me.
No, 100%. And you know, I mean, listen, I think that there are definitely things in the hierarchy of when you have to go, and it is clearly time that you need to separate from your employer. Yeah. And there's other times where you can have them, there's sort of teachable moments. I mean, you know, I always say to clients, I mean, I feel like a broken record because I say it all the time, you know, good employees can end up on your radar, so to speak. And it's not that unusual that a good employee could have any number of things going on, family issues, you know, financial issues, other things going on in their life that are outside of the workspace that sometimes come into the workspace and they end up on your radar. And it's really more of a fluke. I mean, they're just, you know, it's a very specific circumstance. You can have a discussion with them. And you know what? A good employee will drop back off of your radar. You're not going to hear from them maybe one more time, but it's really not likely. An employee that is not a good fit for your organization will pop up on your radar multiple times. And when they pop up on your radar multiple times, you know, these are like what you said, they're warning signs, they're flags, they're indications that maybe there is a much larger issue going on here and you have to deal with it. So, you know, in the question that we received, you know, how do we deal with an employee that's having performance issues? I mean, well, what kind of performance issues? Is this just because, you know, maybe they're dealing with, you know, childcare issues right now, and it's very difficult for them to come to work because they have problems with childcare. So, you know, what's really the underlying issue? What's going on here? Is this something that you can help the employee and facilitate getting them back off your radar and back, you know, to a spot where they're operating for you the way that you need them to? Or is this a situation where you really are seeing this person for a long time really hasn't been a good fit for the organization? We just are now realizing it, and it's unfortunate that we're, you know, in the space now. And, you know, listen, there are lots of employers that have gotten, you know, PPP loans, and they still need to make decisions about their organization, and letting one person go is not going to really make a difference for your PPP loan. I mean, you can also, you know, rehire people. I think, you know, what matters is like what you said, you know, at the end of the day, are you meeting the criteria ultimately where you need to be when you get towards the, you know, the end of the loan period?
So, you know, I know we have about 8 minutes left. So if there's anyone that is attending with us, and I see lots of you there, we'd love to hear your questions. We'd love to hear your comments. You can drop it in the Q&A section, and we'll take some time to answer those.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, we've had some other questions, and I feel what's so nice about, you know, I guess the morning, you know, people may be more, you know, apt to be at work and not necessarily tuning in for a webinar. Maybe they'll tune in at some other point. But we did have some other questions. One of the other questions that we had got was from Rhonda, and she was asking about, you know, what kind of, you know, expansion, or have there been any discussions about expanding workers' comp? And Rhonda, it was interesting because I thought it was a really good question, because one of the things that we've been talking about as lawyers is that there is maybe this potential to see an uptick in workers' comp claims of people who are claiming, for example, that they got sick after they came to work. And, you know, I've had clients, for example, that have been concerned and, you know, asking questions about what do I need to do to protect myself. And I think, you know, generally workers' comp should protect you, because the idea of workers' comp is it provides tort immunity for an employer. So you're not going to get sued for negligence, you know, for not creating a safe workspace. So if you're doing the things that you need to do to make sure people are safe, you should be fine. You know, but the flip side of it is, and, you know, I'm definitely, I don't work, you know, in an insurance company, but I can tell you they make decisions about the claims and they decide whether or not they're going to pay on a claim. And at the end of the day, what a person needs to substantiate is that they in fact got COVID-19 in the workspace. And, you know, while that may seem for some a small hurdle, really, it's not. I mean, you know, and I think about it from my perspective, it's unless you're seeing what I'll call large numbers of people who are getting sick in the workspace all at once, you know, that may be something where it's maybe a little easier to make a connection, but it's not that easy when people are going to the grocery store, going to the banks, visiting family, visiting friends, etc. And how do you prove that, for example, they got sick at work versus they got sick somewhere else and it just happened to manifest itself when the employer was taking temperatures or asking questions and found out, lo and behold, the person may have been exposed to COVID-19.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I keep hearing as a you know, a connecting theme in those questions about safety, because you know, our conversation was couched as beyond the safety measures, right? But I hear that there's still a lot of concern from people as it relates to not only being safe from a health perspective, but being safe from an employment perspective and not wanting to be sued, quite frankly, right? And so the interesting thing is when we think about it from there, it's a very limiting place to come from as it relates to really expanding your organization or your business beyond where it is and really moving out of this period, right? And getting back to a sense of growth and upward movement, if you will. I see all of those things and all of those opportunities as a way to help us really flatten the curve on the virus. So if you're taking the measures in your organization to check temperatures, to make sure you're wearing masks, to do all of those things, you're being extremely responsible and a really great, you know, not only business owner or organizational leader, but a really great citizen to help us flatten this curve, because it could be your temperature checking that helps to get, you know, responsive, quick treatment for someone that otherwise would have gone undetected or would have infected other people that may be more adversely impacted by the virus. So I want us to expand that a bit and see it as not, I've got to do this just to protect myself against all of the things that could come back to harm me or my organization or my business, but I am also responsible for helping us to flatten the curve by allowing my organization, by allowing my business to be a conduit through which we help identify the things that continue to create, you know, to create hazards for us or to create gaps where we may have gaps, whether it be COVID or whether it be racism or whether it be any other ism, inequality, inefficiency, or anything that's impacting your organization, because that's how we really create change. In order to do that, we've got to shift the things that we do in practice, and that's how we create a different culture, and that's how we create the results that we want.
No, absolutely. And I think it's this concept of, you know, we want to move forward. I mean, nobody wants to live in the past. I think it's important to think about those things and to talk about them, you know, but it's really, you know, how do we move forward? Because, you know, life is a forward trajectory. I mean, we don't have the luxury of getting in time machines and going back in time and fixing things. We just have to go forward. And what does that forward look like? And, you know, from my perspective, you know, I had clients that back in March, for example, were doing temperature checks, were doing questionnaires and doing things that, you know, I have some clients, for example, that even as recent as last week were not doing temperature checks. And well, listen, it goes back to the point of Michelle had asked, how much of the CDC do we need to incorporate, and, at what level do we have, to say, like, maybe we can't expect this, but I think that there's, sort of a minimum of what you should be doing, and whether it is safety, and when it does come to safety, what are the few things that you can do, because it doesn't take a whole lot to make sure that there's safety in the workspace. And, also to look and see what other types, maybe through your insurance carrier, maybe through workers' comp insurance carrier, for example, that there are other benefits. I have a lot of clients that have teledoc, for example, and, insurance companies that also have this, aspect where employees, if they do, check the box and say, I had a fever, or, for example, the temperature is checked, then are asked to leave, and really to take care of themselves. I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, people do need to take care of themselves. We all understand that, somebody, for example, who's working, at an hourly rate, and if they don't clock in, they're not getting paid that day. But, that's where it's like, there's got to be some flexibility in policies. What are you doing as an employer to make sure people feel safe? If you didn't offer, sick leave, just, regular sick leave, not necessarily, that emergency paid sick leave, that you're seeing that the law now provides if you have COVID-19, but what else are you doing? Because I don't think we really have the luxury, at least not right now, of saying, oh, it's okay that you've come to work and you have a fever, but you're not displaying anything else related to COVID-19. We just can't take that risk. I mean, I think we have to be proactive about those sorts of things, and to tell a person, listen, it's okay if you don't come to work. I mean, you're not going to lose your job if you stay home and take care of yourself. In fact, we want you to do that. We don't want you to come to work when you don't feel well.
Right. I know we're right at 11:30, but we have a comment in the Q&A, Jamie, that I think would be great for you to read. And I love this comment because it's a really great way to kind of take us out, right, for this segment. And I'll make this statement that as I was thinking about it, progress can be deterred by the quest for perfection. And so as I say that, I think this comment is so perfectly intertwined in that thought. And so I'd love for you to read it, because I'm telling you, I can't see it all.
Oh man, I can't pull it up either. I'm kind of a little bit.
It's in the Q&A section. It's actually.
Can you tell me what it says?
So here, I'm gonna try to blow it up and tell you. So employers complain of getting 70% out of an employee. Isn't it better to get the 70% rather than force the employee to return to the work site and infect other employees, thereby losing 100%? Because of infected employees? And that's from Justice Rahab, who's retired. I love that, because, and it's a matter of sometimes what we're looking at as 70%, and Jamie, you said this before, it might be wise to consider how the circumstances and the situations and the context that we're in might call for us to do things differently. So I love that, because what it suggests is that sometimes we've got to recalibrate, and we've got to look at how we're measuring things, and things have shifted. And so maybe the metrics and maybe the standards that we were using before, we don't need to lower them. We may need to reconsider if they are appropriate given our new context. So thank you for that.
No, 100%. I mean, and it goes back to, you got to decide what's right for your organization. I mean, and sometimes, listen, it's all about perspective. Sometimes 70, 75%, 80% may be good enough. I mean, and sometimes good enough is okay. And it really just depends on the circumstance. If for example, 70% is just because the person's not showing up because they're not committed, maybe again, and it's like what you would say, Shanequa, maybe there's something else, like you got to take a little bit of a step back and look at the big picture, because maybe this is big picture stuff. Maybe it's not really just, what you're dealing with right here, for example. So I think, this has always been great for me and very eye-opening, and I love talking to you, and I love our conversations, and I want to obviously continue to do them again. And so hopefully everybody that joined us today, thank you. And if you liked it, you'll keep tuning in, and please send your questions to us, and we'll do what we can to get them and answer all of them. And we hope that in the meantime, everybody stays safe and takes care of themselves and their families. and tune in next time.
Thank
Bye.
you.